Welcome to the deep dive. We had a really interesting question sent in. What kind of problems did England face as it industrialized?
Yeah, it's a huge topic, a period of massive change.
Totally. So we've gathered some historical resources to explore this big shift. And our goal today is basically to give you a clear picture of the challenges that popped up during this, well, transformative time in English history.
Exactly. Industrialization brought incredible new tech, economic growth, all of that. But it also created some pretty significant hurdles for loads of people in England.
Right. Hurdles is a good way to put it. We're going to try and unpack what some of those key problems really were.
Let's do it.
All right, so maybe let's start with a really big one, urbanization. Now, England back then,
Mm.
lots of farms, countryside, right? So what exactly do we mean by urbanization in this context?
Well, simply put, it's the growth of cities. It's when huge numbers of people start moving away from those rural areas, the villages and farms, and pack into towns and
The
cities.
population just balloons in the urban centers.
Precisely. Swells is a good word.
And what was the main driver for this during England's industrialization? Like what pulled everyone towards the cities?
Jobs, mostly. Simple as that. All these new factories springing up needed workers, lots of work.
The factories were mainly in the cities.
Yeah, overwhelmingly. So people left the agricultural life behind, hoping for work in these new industries. It was a massive internal migration.
Okay, so suddenly cities have way more people than they're used to.
Hmm.
What did that do to the cities themselves? That must have caused some issues.
Oh, enormous strain. Yeah. Imagine a small town suddenly getting like 10 times bigger almost overnight.
Wow.
The existing setup, things like housing, clean water systems, how they dealt with waste, just wasn't built for that explosion of people. Cities grew incredibly fast, often, really haphazardly without much planning.
Which sounds like a perfect recipe for our next point. Epidemics. Sounds bad. What exactly is an epidemic?
Yeah. An epidemic is basically when an infectious disease spreads really, really quickly and it hits a large number of people in one area. It's way more than just a few people getting sick. It's a proper widespread outbreak.
Okay, and how did that urbanization we were just talking about, all those people crammed together, make epidemics, well, more likely?
It basically created the ideal breeding ground for disease. When you have tons of people living cheek by jowl, often in really cramped housing with poor sanitation.
Yeah.
It's just so much easier for germs to spread from person to person. Things we take for granted, like clean water or effective sewage disposal, often totally lacking. And that became a massive factor in how quickly illnesses could tear through a population.
Ugh. So these overcrowded cities were like incubators for disease.
Hmm.
That paints a pretty bleak picture, which brings us straight to slums. What exactly is a slum?
Slums are areas in a city defined by really poor housing, severe overcrowding, and just a lack of basic necessities. Think no clean water, no proper sanitation. They're essentially these neighborhoods where people are forced to live in completely inadequate and, frankly, unhealthy conditions.
And how did that rapid city growth we mentioned, that urbanization, how did that lead to these slum areas popping up all over England?
Well, the sheer speed and number of people arriving just overwhelmed the ability to build decent housing fast enough.
Right, supply couldn't meet demand.
Exactly. So to house everyone, developers threw up cheap, really basic housing super quickly. These places were often tiny, poorly built, no proper ventilation, no access to clean water or sewers.
Awful.
Yeah. And because so many people desperately needed any kind of roof over their heads, these terrible conditions became widespread, creating these large, distinct slum areas in the industrial cities.
So you've got these incredibly crowded, unhealthy places. What were the sort of daily realities for people living there?
Oh, life was incredibly tough. Like we said, lack of clean water and sanitation meant disease was just constant, always there. The overcrowding meant zero privacy, and it just made spreading illness even easier. Air quality was often terrible, bad ventilation, coal smoke, waste piling up. These were areas of extreme poverty where just getting through the day was a struggle.
It's really hard to wrap your head around those conditions.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Debtors' prisons. What were those?
Debtors' prisons were exactly what they sound like. Jails specifically for people who owed money debts that they couldn't pay back.
So if you couldn't pay your bills, you could be locked up.
Pretty much. You could be imprisoned until the debt was somehow settled, often relying on family or friends to bail you out, literally.
And how did the changes from industrialization maybe make it more likely for people to end up in these places?
Well, the new industrial economy created wealth, yes, but it was also really unstable for a lot of ordinary working people.
Right, boom and bust cycles.
Exactly. Economic downturns meant Factories might close, people would lose their jobs without warning, and if you lost your job, paying your rent, your bills, any debts you had, it became impossible very quickly.
I see.
So while debtors' prisons weren't new, they existed before, the economic volatility of this period probably pushed more people into financial ruin and, potentially, into prison for debt. It was a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
Lose your job, get jailed, then you can't work to pay off the debt.
That sounds incredibly harsh and just counterproductive. Okay, let's move to something particularly grim. Child labor. What are we talking about here?
Child labor is, well, it's the employment of children in work, but during industrialization, it usually meant kids working in really dangerous, exploitative conditions.
Like in factories and mines?
Yes, exactly. For incredibly long hours, pitiful pay, doing jobs that were often incredibly harmful to their health and development.
Why did industrialization lead to such a huge increase in child labor in England? What was the thinking?
Fundamentally, the factories and mines needed a massive workforce, and owners were always looking to cut costs.
And children were cheap labor.
The cheapest. They could be paid far less than adults. And sometimes, horribly, their small size was actually seen as an advantage, for crawling into tight spaces in mines or fixing machinery.
Oh, that's awful.
Yeah. The well-being, the education, the childhood of these kids was often completely ignored in the drive for profit. It's one of the darkest aspects of the era.
So, what were the conditions actually like for these children?
Appalling, really. We're talking incredibly long hours. 12, 14 hours a day wasn't uncommon. Very few breaks, if any.
Unbelievable.
The work itself was often highly dangerous. Heavy, fast-moving machinery in factories, the constant risk of cave-ins or gas explosions in mines. Injuries were common, illness from the dust and fumes, exhaustion.
To no school, obviously.
No chance of education, which basically locked them into a cycle of poverty. It's truly heartbreaking to consider.
It really is.
Huh.
Okay, let's look at how society itself was changing. We've talked a lot about the working class and those in poverty, but what about the middle class? Who were they?
Right, the middle class. This is a group in society that's sort of positioned between the working class and the upper class, the aristocracy.
Okay.
It typically included people like professionals doctors, lawyers, teachers, but also business owners, shopkeepers, managers, skilled engineers, that sort of thing. Generally, they had more education and better economic stability than the working class.
And how did industrialization actually cause this middle class to grow?
Well, the explosion of new industries and businesses just created a whole host of new opportunities.
Makes sense.
As factories got bigger and trade expanded, you needed more people to manage operations, provide professional services like law and banking, run the shops that sold all the new goods. Successful entrepreneurs, inventors, skilled workers, they could climb the ladder, They formed this expanding middle class, offering a path for social advancement that maybe hadn't existed quite like that before.
So life was improving for this group. How did their living conditions and, opportunities stack up against the working class or those in the slums?
Oh, the difference was stark. Huge contrast. The middle class generally lived in much more comfortable homes, often in newer parts of town, away from the worst of the factory pollution.
Right.
They had better access to food, clothing, healthcare. Crucially, their children often had the chance to get an education, maybe go on to university or enter a profession. It was a world away from the daily struggle for survival faced by many in the working class and the slums.
So industrialization was creating more divisions in society in some ways, it sounds like.
You could definitely argue that, yes. Wealth was being created, but it wasn't being shared equally, leading to wider gaps.
Okay, now what about the very top? The traditional upper class, the aristocrats. Who were they, and how did industrialization mess with their place in English society?
The aristocrats were the traditional elite. Think dukes, earls, lords, people with inherited titles, usually vast amounts of land passed down through generations. Their wealth and social standing were primarily based on land ownership and family lineage. They'd been the dominant force for centuries.
And how did the rise of industry, factories, and all this new money affect their traditional power? Did it knock them off their perch?
Not entirely, not overnight. They certainly kept their high social status and a lot of political influence for a long time, but Their economic dominance started to face a real challenge.
Ah, from the new money.
Exactly. The massive wealth being generated by factories, trade, finance, this new industrial wealth, meant that owning land, while still important, wasn't the only major source of power and influence anymore.
Right.
These factory owners, bankers, the successful middle-class entrepreneurs, they started accumulating fortunes that could rival, sometimes even surpass, the wealth of the old landed aristocracy. So you see this gradual shift in economic power, even if the social hierarchies took longer to adjust.
Interesting. A real shift in the dynamics. Okay, one more group to talk about. The Luddites. Who were the Luddites and why did they appear during this period?
The Luddites. Right. They were a group of workers, mainly skilled textile workers, active in the early 19th century. And they were very strongly opposed to the new machines being introduced into the textile
There's
factories.
new looms and things.
Yes, particularly things like automated power looms and knitting frames.
And what was their big objection? Why did they hate these machines so much?
Well, they feared the machines would take their jobs. It's a classic story, really.
Automation anxiety, even back then.
Absolutely. These machines could do the work much faster and often required fewer skilled operators. So the Luddites saw them as a direct threat to their employment, their wages, and their whole way of life as skilled artisans. They felt their craft was being devalued and destroyed.
So it was about protecting their livelihoods and skills.
Yeah.
How did they actually protest? What did they do?
Their main tactic, the one they're famous for, was direct action. They would break into factories, often at night, and physically destroy the machines they blamed for their troubles.
Wow. Actually smashing the machine.
Yes. Machine breaking became their signature form of protest. It was a way to resist the changes, to try and, put the brakes on this industrial march that they felt was crushing them.
It sounds like a pretty desperate, maybe even violent response to a really difficult situation.
It was certainly born out of desperation. They felt they had no other way to make their voices heard or protect their futures.
Okay, wow. We've definitely covered a lot of the downsides and problems caused by industrialization here. Could we maybe just quickly recap the main points we've hit?
Yeah, absolutely. So we saw industrialization driving rapid urbanization that led to severe overcrowding, poor sanitation, and consequently, the easy spread of epidemics.
Right. And the lack of decent housing resulted in the growth of slums with just terrible living conditions.
hmm Then there's the economic instability, which likely worsened financial hardship for many, possibly increasing the numbers ending up in debtors' prisons.
And the really awful rise of exploitative child labor in factories and mines.
Definitely. But we also saw the rise of a new, prosperous middle class, even as the traditional aristocracy began to see its economic dominance challenged by industrial wealth.
And finally, the social unrest and resistance, like the Luddite movement, showing how workers feared the impact of new technology on their jobs.
So it's a complex picture.
Absolutely. It's crystal clear that while industrialization brought huge technological leaps in economic growth, it also unleashed a whole cascade of serious social problems and immense challenges for many, many people in England. It really wasn't just a simple story of progress.
No, not at all. It was a period of massive upheaval, immense hardship for large segments of the population, alongside those advancements.
Understanding both sides, the good and the bad, is so important, isn't it?
Crucial. It helps us grasp the true complexity of historical change and how these big transformations affect real people's lives in profoundly different ways.
So as you've heard, the Industrial Revolution in England was, well, incredibly complex. It brought progress, yes, but also this wave of really significant problems. From the way cities were reshaped, often becoming unhealthy places, to the deep struggles of the working class, and even resistance like the Luddites. This deep dive really highlights what a pivotal and often difficult era it was. We hope this is giving you a clearer understanding of the challenges.
Yeah, hopefully that sheds some light.
Now, just to help you think a bit more about everything we've discussed, here are a few questions you could mull over. First off, can you explain in your own words how building factories led directly to cities getting so big, so fast?
And what were maybe 2 or 3 key reasons why diseases spread so easily in those industrial English cities?
How would you describe the living conditions in the slums, and how was that directly connected to urbanization?
Thinking about the economy, how might the changes during industrialization have made it tougher for some people to stay out of debt?
Why were children actually employed in places like factories and mines? Even though it was so dangerous, what were the reasons?
How did the growth of that middle class we talked about actually change the social structure, the different layers of society in England?
And the aristocracy, in what ways did industrialization challenge their traditional power and influence?
Finally, what exactly were the Luddites protesting against, and what does their movement tell us about how industrialization impacted ordinary workers?